Thank you. Thank you, Russ.
So thank you so much for being here, taking time out of your busy schedule. In addition to these lovely people, we've got folks in our state chapters across the country watching us tonight via live stream. You just met with some of our folks from Georgia, but I wanted to recognize that they're here. Is the Georgia team, if you could stand up real quick. So. We're glad to have the Georgia folks in the house and some state directors from all across the country who came in as well to listen to the wisdom that you're going to bestow upon us today. I wanted to start with what could be an elephant in the room, though, right? Because we've been talking about this issue of debt and deficits and spending for decades. Politicians, pundits, economists have all given dire warnings about what's going to happen, but very little has been done to rein it in.
Yeah.
And because of that, we've seen really two groups of cynics develop. The first group largely looks at the problem and says it's not a problem, right? They've become deniers, and they look at people like us and say, oh, you're just chicken little alarmist. And the second group are people who recognize that it's a really significant problem, but they don't believe that Washington has the willpower or the ideas to fix it. How do you respond to those two groups?
Well, first of all, they're both right. The second one, except the first one, is the only reason they're right is that we have the reserve currency. And so the reality is we have been able to borrow everything we needed. The problem is there's going to come a day if we don't stop that, we'll lose that right. We are the reserve currency since 1922, I believe it is. And remember, the UK pound was a reserve currency before then, and they borrowed a lot too, and it was their downfall. So we have history to tell us that you can't keep doing this forever. The second group is right from the standpoint that we are in a crisis, in my view. Congress has never had the political will to stand up to this and to do the right thing. And this goes back into the history of how the Congress was set up, but that's for another day and another conversation. But I will tell you this, that we believe now that there are things that we can do in the immediate future. There's a growing nucleus of people in the Senate anyway who are beginning to say, yes, it's a crisis and we have to do something about it. In American history, Americans have always been the best in the world and best in history that I can find of dealing with a crisis. We're just always the slowest to figure out we're in a crisis. And it's true, the only difference between us and Greece today is that we're the reserve currency. It's a fact. I mean, we'll talk about the debt in more detail later, but the first thing is I think there's a growing awareness around the country. And I think you saw it in presidential politics in 2016. You're going to see it again in 2020. You certainly saw it in my race. I never had any idea that I wanted to be in this business, in politics. After a business career, the debt's what pulled me in here. And there are things that we can do. I'd love to talk about the 4 or 5 areas that we can address to deal with this debt. But first of all, everybody in America has got to realize we have a crisis, and it's right here, right now.
So the year I was born, I'll date myself, was 1981. It is the first year that our nation hit $1 trillion in national debt. So it took 205 years from the beginning of the Republic to our first trillion. And in the 37 years since, we've multiplied by 22.
Yep.
This is going to be a very broad question, but how did we do that? How did we get there?
Well, after 22, we became the reserve currency. And so we had a liberalization go on in the 20th century, though. The progressives were really the dominant player in that period of time. There have been 4 political supermajorities, all Democratic. And I agree with the statement you made earlier in the introduction, is that both parties are guilty. There are no innocent parties in Washington, D.C. in terms of the debt. Let's just get that clear. But in fact, we got here because the U.S. became much more liberal in terms of its social safety net, in terms of its economic outlook, in terms of our philanthropy around the world, and our military spending in terms of taking care of security for other folks. In the year 2000, after Bill Clinton, I think we had 2 years of where we actually had a balanced, quote, budget for 2 years during those eight years, partly because of Reaganomics and partly because of the run-up of the dot-com bubble in the 90s. But in 2000, we had $6 trillion of debt. It's about 50% of our total GDP. At the end of Bush's 8 years, we had $10 trillion. And then in 8 years under President Obama, we went to $20 trillion. So in 8 short years, we basically added as much debt as we had in 220 years. We got here because the federal government and politicians have decided that spending is not the worst thing we can do. And that's the problem. We have a situation right now where we know that the liberalization of Social Security in the 60s under the Great Society is what is bankrupting that trust fund today. As you said, it goes to zero by most estimates by 2035. And there are things we can do to solve that and to save Social Security. Medicare actually goes to zero. That trust fund goes to zero in 7 years. We're already subsidizing those trust funds today. So I think we got here because of political schemes where the easiest way to get elected is to give away money. And the number one drive in Washington, D.C. is the drive to get reelected.
We talk a lot about the budget process, and we're going to get into that more as we go through the conversation tonight. But I think it would be helpful, particularly for activists in our network that understand that Washington is spending too much money, but sometimes don't necessarily understand the process by which that happens. Because the process is very, very important to ultimately solving the problem.
It is.
To the point of the legislation that you've introduced. One of the things that I hear sometimes when I talk to people about this problem, they'll say, well, if we just cut congressional salaries and we cut out waste, fraud, and abuse, we'd be on the right track. We know that's not true. But in talking about the budget process, for some folks, I think it would be helpful to sort of distinguish between the discretionary spending versus the mandatory spending side.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, first of all, I'm on the budget committee. And when you get in the Senate, they assign you all these committees, and you fight hard to get on a few committees. So I fought hard to get on the budget committee, only to realize that it's the most powerful, it's the least powerful committee in the entire Senate because it doesn't even produce a bill. It produces a resolution. And we're the only country in the world that has a three-step process. But let me back up and put this in perspective. Let me ask the audience here, how much do you think we spend this year in FY19? Just raise your hand and shout out a number. What do you think the total expenditures of the United States federal government are this year? Just anybody. Ballpark.
700 billion.
700 billion. How much? Anybody else? I heard another number back here is pretty close. How much? $1 trillion. We spend $4.6 trillion, the federal government this year. $4.6 trillion. Now, the fact is that you are paying attention by your mere presence here at an AFP meeting here in D.C. Some of you traveled to be here. You're the ones paying attention. We haven't done a very good job of explaining the math. It's no more, I don't know what $1 trillion is. It's a million, but even I can't tell you what $1 trillion is. But I can tell you what 4.6 looks like. Well, here's the makeup of 4.6. We spend $1.3 trillion in discretionary spending. That means that's money that we get to debate. This is like your home budget. But we spend $3.3 trillion on mandatory. That means that we don't have a choice in that. We have to spend that no matter what. Well, that's just like your home budget. So your mandatory at home is your mortgage, your car payment, your insurance payment. It's automatically deducted. That's 70% of what we spend, folks. The $1.3 trillion is discretionary. That's a vacation, that's money to go out to dinner, it's entertainment, it's in your home budget. Here, discretionary is made up of basically three things. It's defense budget, which this year was about $716 billion. It's VA, we have VA in there, and then all domestic discretionary spending is in the $1.3 trillion. That's what all this machination is about up here. The government shutdowns, I mean, in the last 45 years, since the budget process was put in place, the government has actually been shut down because it wasn't funded 21 times. We'll talk about the budget process in a minute, but right now I want to finish talking about the makeup of this spending because $4.6 trillion is what we spend, and we're borrowing $1 trillion in round numbers today to make that work, $1 trillion. So imagine if you were borrowing almost 25% of what you spend at home, how long do you think you'd be able to do that? Why does the world allow us to do that? The good faith and credit of the federal government is the only reason I can see, and the fact that we're the reserve currency, and the fact that we're the best of a bad lot, frankly. The only difference between us and Greece is the fact that we're the reserve currency. I come back to that every single time. But realize the mandatory is made up of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, pension and benefits for federal employees, and the interest on the debt. And here's what's so insidious about this. I'm going to show you a chart in just a second. The fastest growing item in our expense sheet of the $4.6 trillion is interest expense. We've had 9 run-ups in the last 2 years in the Fed fund rate, and that added $450 billion of new interest. We're in a government that doesn't have a balance sheet. We're in a government that doesn't have anything, or an expense sheet. It really doesn't have it doesn't have a capital budget. It basically runs everything out of cash flow. But I'm going to show you this chart is a chart of our spending historically and is a projected, I hope you can pick this up online. The top line, the green line, is total expenditures, and the red dotted line, vertical, going straight up and down, is today, 2019, and we'll spend somewhere around $4.5, $4.6 trillion next year. So the green line is going. Now that's the next 20 years. You can see what it's done the last 10 years, and then look to the right and you'll see the next 20 years. It's exploding. Well, why is the green line, the total, exploding? The red line down below, the solid red line, is mandatory expenditures. You can see it. That's exploding. Look at what discretion is doing. Historically, since 2011, we're spending about the same amount of money in discretionary spending as we did in 2009 because of the budget caps and because of sequestration. Two things that I would do differently, but that has been the effect, is discretionary spending is pretty flat for the last decade or so. But look, it even starts to go up in the out years. But the number one reason we have this debt crisis is not discretionary spending, it's on the mandatory side. And that comes from the liberalization of Medicare and Social Security primarily over the last 50 years.
So one thing I failed to mention, we have some questionnaire cards that will get passed out. If you have a question that you want to reserve for the end of the program, if we have time, we'll do some question and answers as well. In talking about the budget process, though, I'll try and summarize the way it's supposed to work, and then you correct me and tell me how it actually works. So the way that it's supposed to work is that agencies are supposed to work with the Office of Management and Budget under the President by submitting a request, and they kind of have a negotiation process for what they'd like for the following fiscal year. The President's supposed to submit a budget proposal to Congress. Congress is supposed to do budget resolutions in both chambers, essentially saying this is how much we'll authorize to spend. And then once they agree on that, the appropriation subcommittees, and there are 12 of them in each chamber, are supposed to come up with specific budgets using that total spend number. The President signs it, everybody's happy. We have a new fiscal year that starts on October 1st. How often has that happened?
4 times in 45 years. That wasn't a setup. I didn't know he was going to ask that question. 4 times in 45 years. The 74 Budget Act was put in place to streamline the budgeting process. Gosh, where do I start on this thing, Russ? First of all, in 1921, well, if you go back all the way, go look at the Constitution. The Constitution in Article 2 never gave the administration any involvement in the spending of money. They were so afraid we'd have a monarch, which is what they were trying to avoid, that they fought that like crazy, and they did not put it in the Article 2 definition and responsibilities of the executive branch. But in Article 1, when it talked about the responsibilities of the legislative branch, it went song and verse, paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, what we want to do. So in 1921, we created basically the Office of Management and Budget and got the executive branch in. How we did that, I don't know, but that's the way we handle it today. So you are right. We laid this all out in that sequence of events. But here's the other thing. In 2015, when I got elected, I came in and we formed a working group, about a dozen Republicans and 3 or 4 Democrats, some ex-governors who come from places where this process actually works. And we started an investigation. We said, well, look, we got to change this process. It's only worked 4 times in 44 years. We've used 186 continuing resolutions in that 45-year period. And I said earlier, government has actually been shut down by Congress 21 times in those 45 years. But only 4 times has the government been fully funded by the end of the fiscal year. Fiscal year is September 30th today. This is what's supposed to happen in the first year of a new Congress. First of all, the fiscal year starts October 1, as you just said. In the first year of a new Congress, we don't even get elected until November, and then they start in January, right? So guess what? We're already into Q2 before the folks even show up. That's how smart we've been in setting the fiscal year and the calendar year for the Congress. So now you're 3 months into a process where you're supposed to do the following. We're the only entity in the world that does it this way. We have a budget process, an authorization process, and an appropriating process. And I'll tell you today, the only one that works is the appropriating process. The budget process, it takes 14 weeks. That's what we've set out in the schedule. You have 16 authorizing committees, 16. This is armed services, it's state, it's foreign relations, it's all of these. And then there are 12 appropriating committees. And then we're the only entity in the world that does that. And that's 14 weeks, 16 weeks, and then 12 weeks. There's not enough calendar time in a year to even think about doing that. When I first got here in 15, I was assigned the chair position of State Department oversight within the Foreign Relations Committee. Well, I realized we hadn't authorized the State Department in 15 years. So we've already bypassed the process. You have to get anything done. And last year, we got to 75% funding because we bypassed it again. It's the first time in 22 years last year that we actually got there. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to show you a perfect illustration of how bad this process is. We have a chart, another chart here. This was kind of in the dark, but maybe you can pick it up on camera. On the left of this chart, I call this a spaghetti chart. Any of you play pickup sticks when you're kids? You know, you drop it and it all kind of forms a mess. Tell me that's not what that looks like. You know, and so on the left are the authorizing committees. I don't roll this out in mixed company, y'all. I have to be very careful where I show this chart because people say, no, you got to be wrong. You know I'm right. The 16 authorizing committees on the left relate to the 12 appropriating committees on the right. Now, how many of those things you think have a one-on-one relationship? So if you want to fund defense and appropriate defense, you got to go across about 6 different authorizing groups. Imagine how often that happens. It doesn't. Make it worse, we're all signed to 4 or 5 committees. They all meet at the same time. And so you ever watch a hearing on TV and you say, well, there are no senators in there. It's because they're all at 3 or 4 other meetings. This is why. This is ridiculous, and it's going to ultimately have to change as part of what I'm proposing in these budget talks that we're talking about. But the process is broken. Look, we'll never solve the debt crisis. I don't want to fix the budget process just to fix the budget process. It's one of the 5 steps you have to do, though, to fix the debt crisis. And now's as good a time, Russ, if you want. I can lay this out. I mean, this is just one person's view of it. But a business would look at it this way. And by the way, most states, 44 states, have balanced budget laws, have no fiscal problems, because they have laws that say if you don't get the budget done, you don't go home. They work 45 days a year. And guess what? That's what the U.S. federal government did for the first 130 years. The Senate and the House only met 45 days a year. Career politicians were never imagined by the founders of this country. That's a late 20th century manifestation. Until 1913, the Senate was appointed and wasn't elected. Then it became elected. We created the IRS and several other progressive ideas. But if you want to solve the debt crisis, you got to grow the economy, which we're doing. I'll talk about that in a little bit if you want. You got to fix this budget process. You got to get rid of redundant spending, and that's both discretionary and mandatory. You got to save Social Security and Medicare, because these are the things going to hang around our neck if we don't do that. And lastly, we've wasted a decade talking about health care insurance. We should have been talking about health care costs.
I was going to say my 4-year-old draws things like that right there.
Yeah.
So that's what that looks like to me.
You know, and I bet it works more than 4 times out of 45 too, right, when he does it.
There you go. So you talked a little bit about continuing resolutions, just so people have a sense of what that is. A continuing resolution, an omni, a mini, these terms that get thrown around. What does all that stuff mean?
Well, what happens is, in the business world, if I didn't get a budget done and get it approved by the board and start implementing it before the end of the fiscal year so that the banks and the lenders and the stockholders and the employees and the customers all knew what we were doing, I'd have been fired. I mean, and the board would have been fired. I mean, it's no more complicated than that. You do it like breathing. You don't think about this process. It just happens. A continuing resolution only exists in the United States federal government. This is the only place I've ever found one. And that is, oh, well, if you don't get your job done by the end of the fiscal year, we'll let you keep funding the government. Just keep funding it at last year's level. Well, that doesn't sound so draconian until you get into the details of it. But for the military, it's devastating. If you have a new program that's coming in, like a new airplane that you're trying to build, that gets delayed until you actually get past the CR. If you have training, it gets interrupted. You can't continue past the end of the fiscal year or the past of the date when the CR is done. You can't start new contracts. And I submit to you that it causes our procurement costs in the military to go up astronomically because of this. Our personnel costs are higher than they should be. Even our VA costs are higher than they should be because of the CR impact on spending. So these manifestations of not doing the budget and the appropriating work on time are actually some of the reasons why the expenses are continue to go up no matter what you do in terms of appropriation.
So now that we kind of have a baseline for how the budget itself works, I want to return to this idea that some people are pushing that essentially says debt doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of growing movement around this notion that debt doesn't matter. Now, for people who for a long time have suggested that debt does matter, we often talk about it in terms of a fiscal cliff. Some moment in the future where critical mass gets hit and things really start to take a downturn. But I think I've seen you talk about this before, and it's something that I agree with. It's that we're not looking forward to a debt crisis. We actually are in the midst of a debt crisis. What leads you to draw that conclusion?
There's no question in my mind we're in a debt crisis right now. We're borrowing money to pay interest on the money we've already borrowed. And that's the first indication of a business that's in deep, deep trouble. The second is that we have 70% of our run-up expenses we don't even deal with. I mean, that's the second characteristic of a real crisis. But the third, and I keep comparing us to Greece, if Greece had the ability to borrow money like we do, they wouldn't have a problem. They just keep borrowing. Well, here's the reality. There's a finite, what is debt? Debt is money that somebody pretty much invests, or they print money in our case, to loan to somebody for a reason. And generally it's to get a rate of return on that. People loan the federal government money because they believe in the good faith and credit of the federal government. We've never defaulted on one of our loans yet. However, if you can't borrow, if you're borrowing money to pay interest on the debt you already had, what happens if you can't borrow money? You stop paying interest. Guess it's a vicious cycle, right? We just go right down the toilet. I believe we've been in this crisis for about 15 years. The minute that actually now it's about 19 years, the minute we started getting past 60% of our total economy in terms of size of debt, I think we got in the red zone right there. Today we're over 100%. The only country in the world bigger than ours is Japan. It's like 200%. The only time we've been in this crisis before was after World War II, and that was justified. And President Eisenhower, in 8 years, and never gets enough credit for this, in 8 short years paid that debt down. Not just held on and let inflation devalue it, he actually paid it down. So in my view, the measure of a crisis is how hard is it to get the debt that you need to run the country. And here's the reality. Today there are about $200 trillion of total debt in the world. About $60 trillion of that is sovereign debt. That means government debt. Well, we have 20 trillion, we have a debt clock in my office. You want to get depressed, come sit in my waiting room and watch this thing just spin. It's about $100,000 a second. It really is. We've been looking at this thing. And so what we've got to wake up and realize is that the moment of crisis is past us. The opportunities are there. If you look at our balance sheet, we're very healthy. We're not in any threat of being bankrupt. But the crises are coming at us like crazy. And if we ever lose the ability to borrow the money to pay this interest, and by the way, you said in your opening remarks, it's projected now that by 2023 we'll be spending more on interest on this debt than we are on our military. That will make it the third, as you said, the third most expensive line item on our expense sheet below Social Security and Medicare. Now that's not where we want to go.
And what people don't realize or they're not thinking about is if we're paying all of that interest on debt, it means all the things that people expect government to do get crowded out. So that's not just defense, that's education, that's infrastructure, that's all the things that we think of.
Disaster relief.
Disaster relief.
We just had that. Disaster relief. We fought like crazy for 8 months to get about $19 billion. Every dime of that, folks, was borrowed money. This money we're talking about for defense this year, $750 billion is what the president wants. Every dime of that, by definition, is borrowed money. I mean, we have these military agreements around the world. They're bilateral agreements. It says that if a country's attacked, we will come help them, right? And if we're attacked, they'll come help us. It's a bilateral military agreement, right? South Korea, Japan, Taiwan's a good one. Taiwan, we have an agreement that says if Taiwan's invaded by China, we have to go to Taiwan and help defend Taiwan against China. But to do that, we have to go to China and borrow the money to go to Taiwan, help defend Taiwan against China. Now, that sounds humorous, folks, but read the language. It's the truth. It's exactly where we are. And so how do you define a crisis? That's a pretty good way.
Yeah, the crowded effect to me is a particularly powerful point because there are so many things that people do think of as those core functions that literally we're not going to be able to do at the same level. And to your point, if we're borrowing $1 trillion out of a $4 trillion budget, then essentially the entire discretionary
That's
budget
what I'm saying.
is borrowed.
Absolutely, Russ. That's the math. Yeah, as you said opening, it's just the math. And when you get to the point where all we're doing is talking about how to spend borrowed money, I think you got to sit back and say, hey, we're in a crisis. This is a full-blown crisis. It's what pulled me in here. It's why you're here today. So why are we not dealing with it? Why? Here's my theory. This is one person's theory. I've been up here 4.5 years, and God knows I've been wrong on things in my life, but this one I'm pretty sure about. The political structure that we have is probably the best in the history of the world, representative democracy. I believe in it with every fiber of my being. But when the drive to get reelected puts self-interest above national interest, you have a crisis. And that's where we are. I mean, I can't make it any more simple than that. Look at what we'll do over the next year and a half to elect a new president or reelect the one we've got. I mean, we're going to spend billions of dollars. We're going to waste a lot of time, and we will not get a lot of legislating done because you have a split government right now. You have the Democratic House, and you have a Republican president, Republican Senate. And we don't have 60 votes in the Senate. So I don't anticipate we'll get a lot done this next year, except spend money. And so that's the political reality that's behind all of this. We could talk about structural things, the liberalization of the great society of Social Security. We could talk about the run-up of Medicare and the safety net program today. All that is a function of what I'm trying to describe here is a flaw in our overall structure, and I think we have to deal with that.
So right now we've got $22 trillion, inching towards $23 trillion in debt. CBO says that by 2048 that's going to be $98 trillion. The numbers are just, if they weren't already staggering, they become more staggering. Give me a sense in your mind what it looks like when countries decide that borrowing or lending us money is too risky.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me try to define how big this is today. You said it before. We have $22 trillion of debt. It's going up about $100,000 a second. Within a decade, we'll add 10, no matter what happens because of Social Security and Medicare. I mean, it's just happening unless we deal with it. But over the next 30 years, just take 30 years, it goes up another $130 trillion because of these future unfunded liabilities we're already committed to. These aren't new commitments. These are commitments we've already made, mostly in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, pension benefits for federal employees, and the accrued interest on the debt. So what we have is a situation that's spiraling out of control, and I don't know how to get at it any other way than to start breaking it down into its pieces and start looking for solutions. If you wait until you're in the moment of the crisis, you lose the ability to do with it. So I want to make sure the $130 trillion translates. That's just so big I can't relate to it. But it really translates to be today the liability of each one of us in our household. That liability translates to $1 million. So what the federal government's going to do at the beginning of October 1, new fiscal year, we're going to send all of you two things. We're going to send you your Social Security statement that is totally erroneous, doesn't mean anything. And the second thing we do is we're going to send you a bill, it's like a credit card bill, and says, you owe all these lenders out here $1 million. That's the math. That's the math. The future, 30 years. A lot of you young people are going to live 30 years. Most of us in this room are going to live 30 years. That's what that means, and that's real. That's not made up. That math is very, very close to being directionally correct. And so I want to make sure we understand how bad that is. And then I think to look at now's the time. How do you change this? By putting pressure on the elected officials to break out of the habit of spending more in order to get votes and to kick the can down the road. Kicking the can down the road has not worked for 40 years.
So I appreciate what I think of as being bravery. It's just actually you being truthful in talking about Social Security and Medicare. Because oftentimes when we have these conversations about budget, about debt, about spending, people who don't subscribe to the view that this is dangerous, or perhaps ignore the view that our current trajectory is dangerous, are very quick to say, you guys just don't care about seniors. When in reality, addressing it is a sign that we care about seniors.
Well,
I wonder if you might comment on that a little
I will, thank you. And this goes back to the messaging. The Democrats have labeled the Republicans as the people who want to cut Aunt Susie's Social Security. Republicans try to brand the Democrats as the one that want to raise your taxes. Well, the reality is Social Security can be saved. Notice the word I'm using is saved, not cut, saved. We're funding it right now. It's already in a deficit, and the trust fund goes to zero. What happens when the trust fund goes to zero? The revenue from withholding is only about 65% of the total liability each year. So if the federal government didn't come out of its regular operating accounts with the other 30, 35%, everybody's Social Security would automatically get cut by 30%, 35%. That's not Republicans doing, that's just the math. And so what we've got is a situation where we've known since the 80s this thing was going to be bankrupt, and they even predicted the year pretty accurately. Well, here we are. Well, in 16 years, you've got time to fix that. There are things you can do. You can change the age requirement, you can put means testing in, change the benefit, you can change the withhold. There are a number of things you can do. The time is now to put both. I promise you, if we lock the doors, Russ, right now, we got, 100 people in here. I promise you in the next 30 minutes, we could all agree. We could find a solution that we could all live with. We might not like it, but we could live with it and would protect Social Security in perpetuity. Nobody wants to cut Social Security. Nobody's going to cut Social Security. It can be saved, but we got to get on it right now.
If you do have questions that you've written, if you'll pass them to the end of the aisle, we'll have some folks pick it up towards the end of the program here. So we've addressed some of the big questions. I do think that, really that Social Security Medicare question is one that a lot of people gravitate towards. I know that you have been focused on another angle, though. You very recently sponsored a resolution that essentially said the national debt was the largest national security threat in America. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about how you think debt interacts with our national security interest.
Well, General Mattis said it most eloquently most recently, but several admirals have said that in the past. Several chiefs, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said it, that the greatest threat to our national security is our own national debt. And here's why. First of all, since World War II, we have been the world's policemen. We wanted the rest of the world to develop, so we kind of shouldered the load in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Such that today we spend 3% of our GDP on our military. That's down, by the way, from 4%, which is a 50-year average. Under Barack Obama, we cut that by 25%, the federal government did. Well, Europe spends less than 1%. Now they've agreed under President Trump to come in and double that over the next few years, and that should help us somewhat. But the problem is, if you have to borrow money, if every dime you spend on your military is borrowed money, what does that say to your adversaries if you have one? What does that say to China right now today? They're not borrowing money to invest in their military. They're producing it, just like we did for the last 60, 70 years. It's just that now we're not. And so I believe we're artificially living above our standard of living is some 20 to 30% above what we're earning in America, and we're borrowing about 25 to 30% of what we're spending each year. You can't do that at home. No business can do that. The federal government can't do that either. We're 5% of the world's population. We consume over, a third? We have a third of the total sovereign debt with 5% of the population. That can't continue.
5% of the world's population, 30% of the world's sovereign debt?
Yeah.
That's incredible. So, last elephant in the room, and then we'll get to what solutions look like. We will frequently hear people say, okay, that's fine, I'm with you. We're spending too much money. There's too much debt accumulating. It's a significant problem. But didn't you just support the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
Yeah, I did.
What's your response to those folks that suggest that tax cuts are to blame for the current fiscal situation?
This is what's wrong with the media in Washington. This is why President Trump is President Trump, because he railed about this in 2016. I've been railing about it since 2013 and 2014. Let me tell you how bad this is. The media gets part of it right and the Democrats get part of it right, but there are three parts to this. The first part is the tax bill cost $1.7 trillion. That's fairly accurate. That ain't the end of the story. The CBO says it cost about $1.7 trillion, but they also said, well, but if you grow the economy 0.4 of 1%, less than 0.5%, okay, you more than pay for that, over and above the baseline, which was the Barack Obama average of somewhere around 1.9%. We're doing much more than that now. It also said that if you grow the economy 1 percentage point more than the average, that you would produce about $3 trillion of additional revenue over a decade. That's what we're doing. We're doing more than that right now. So that tax bill, along with regulations, along with energy, and along with the Dodd-Frank bill that we passed in a bipartisan manner last year, has given us the ability to lower the debt curve by $3 trillion over the next decade. Even with that, though, that's one of the 5 things. You've got to grow the economy. We're doing that right now. So, but that's about a third of the problem. You've got to save Social Security. You've got to fix and Medicare. You've got to fix the budget process, and you've got to get health care costs reined in. Those can all be done. We've gotten close to health care. I hope that if we get a second-term president in 2021, and frankly, it's the biggest reason I'm going to give a partisan comment here. The last second-term president didn't take it up. I believe the solution to Social Security and Medicare is going to take a second-term president, frankly. And that, to me, is where I think optimism in America will grow again, and you'll see the rest of the world will just sort of settle down with regard to this debt issue.
So we've talked a lot tonight about the problem. We've addressed on a surface level some of the ways that we might start to address the problem. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about specifically how to fix the budget process as the opening salvo to ultimately addressing how we rein in discretionary spending, how we look at mandatory spending reforms. And I know that you've just rolled out a package of ideas that are ambitious, that I think are part of a good conversation. We see other people sort of doing the same thing, so lots of ideas coming at once, which is exciting. Yeah. Give us a sense of what Fix Funding First looks like.
Well, you say it a lot better.
Which is actually very difficult to say.
You say that a lot better than I do. No, I'm from Georgia, and that's a hard thing for me to say. Fix Funding First. I have to slow down to get it out there, but I think you have to have a base to stand on. Let me ask you a question. If the bank's called you and you're in default of your car payment and you're having trouble making ends meet, we've all kind of been there, you know. And I think it's the part some people in Washington forget, is that getting from payday to payday was it was our mission statement at Dollar General, helping our customers get from payday to payday. But here's the reality. What happens if all of a sudden you have a problem making that payment, okay? Well, what do? You go fix it, because you're looking at your entire budget. You're looking at your discretionary expenses, the things that you have decisions to make about where you go to dinner or go to a movie or go to the ball game or something. But your car payment, your mortgage payment, and all that's pretty well fixed unless you change it. Well, if you start defaulting, you change those things. Well, here's the reality. The only thing since 1921, the only thing we've dealt with is the discretionary part. We might not go out to eat as much. We might not go to that movie or whatever. That is a rounding error. Look at the line here on the bottom. That's discretionary. Look at the red line. That's mandatory. Now, if you're going to fix the problem, what do you got to do? You got to go. So our budget does, our proposal does several things. It breaks it into three components. Let's fix the funding process right now. Then let's include all expenses in the budget, $4.6 trillion. Include it all in the process. And then lastly, fix this budget thing over here, this chopsticks, dropsticks, whatever it is, problem over there with the budget realignment. Those are three ambitious, any one of them is ambitious. The first one's the only one this bill encompasses it right now, though, and it does a few things. It makes the budget a law. If it's just a resolution, nobody pays any attention to it. The appropriators ignore it, it doesn't matter. The second thing is I think you have to change the fiscal year to December 31. So give that first Congress an opportunity to be on time. The third is go to biennial budgeting. Many states do this right now. We did it last year. The year before last, we agreed on what a budget top line would be. And then in 2018, we started appropriating earlier. And because we worked in August, go figure that, we stayed here and worked on the budget in August and went from 12% funding to 75%. First time in 22 years we'd at least got that far. And then the last and most important thing is that we built the appropriating process into buckets. Instead of having 12 bills, we said, let's do 4. They call them mini buses or tranches. I don't care what you call it, but that's what business does. And then have a due date. And if you don't get that piece done by a certain date, nobody goes home until we get it done. Now, guess what? That works in 44 states. That's a best practice. So if you were the board of directors and I was a CEO, you'd be telling me to do that. That's easy to do. We set the dates around these breaks when we have a work week to go home and work. Well, if you don't get that piece of the budget done by that date, nobody goes home. You stay here and get it done. Work on the weekends or whatever until it gets done. Then at the end of the year, if you don't have the whole thing done, and by the way, we set this up like businesses do, so you get the budget and the appropriation done by September 30th. The fiscal year is 12/31, so that gives you a quarter to do oversight and to plan, something we don't do. And then the last thing I would do in this bill is that we set up the budget committee to be a long-range planning committee. Every business does it, every home does it if they do it correctly, and we should be doing it here too.
So we've got several questions that have come in. But before I ask any of these questions, you came from a completely different world. You came from a business world. You were a CEO. You were probably used to things happening much quicker and more efficiently than what you see here. Do you have faith that we can solve this problem?
Absolutely, 100%. I've never been more confident about the United States of America than I am right now, and here's why. I've had a chance to look at the balance sheet. I've looked at the assets. I've looked at the liabilities. This isn't anything that most companies haven't had to deal with. We can deal with this. The political wherewithal, once we get in a crisis, both sides get together. Look at what we did on Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank is a bill that I wanted to repeal the entirety of Dodd-Frank. I want CFPB to go away, or at least come under the auspices of the appropriators in Congress. We have no oversight over CFPB. Dodd-Frank had cost us 17,000 small banks. Since Dodd-Frank was signed, 17,000 banks have gone out of business. And oh, by the way, by repealing the most onerous parts on small community banks, we freed up $2 trillion to come back in the economy. That's part of the $6 trillion that the president's agenda has freed up, or will free up, to come back in the economy. That's what's stimulating all this growth right now.
So do you have about 18 hours to answer questions?
I'd love to be here and do that. This is a privilege to get into this much detail. This topic deserves this much detail, Russ. It's a complicated topic.
Okay, this one's from Angel Vandergrift.
I feel like I'm at a blackjack table.
Yeah, no, I'm
going
to pass out some cards to you. Due to overspending in D.C. and debt rising, do you believe the United States is on its way to another global financial crisis or depression?
Oh, I think we're headed we are in a crisis right now by my definition. So we're not headed for anything. We're already in it. We committed that back, I believe, in 1965, probably even before that in 1921 with some of the laws and things that we did. But certainly in the last 30 years, the irresponsibility of not funding the government on time and then not dealing with this debt in the last 17 to 18 years in a way that is responsible. I believe the wherewithal is here to deal with this, but we have to carve it up into its components and solve each one of these independently.
So this is a spin on my fraud, waste, and abuse comment earlier. I mentioned that a lot of people think if we just cut out fraud, waste, and abuse, we'd be on the right track. But this is a fraud, waste, and abuse question that's specific to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Are there substantive things that can be done to reform that program to make sure that people who are legitimately in need are the ones that benefit?
Absolutely. There's no question. Certainly in the last decade, we've seen a rise in abuse. It's not enough to solve a $1 trillion a year problem, and that's what we have. Of the $4.6 trillion, it's $1 trillion that we're short. It's a little bit less than that this year. It'll be a little bit more than that going forward. Certainly, by getting in and looking at the accountability. Regulations is another part of that, by the way. When the President Trump got elected, he said, for every rule you put in, you got to take 2 out. I think the number now is 22 or so to 1 of rules taken out versus put in. But it's more importantly, which ones did you take out? By freeing up capital and putting more confidence in the system, we freed up, as I said, $6 trillion of real capital coming back into the economy. That builds confidence. And this whole free enterprise system is based on confidence. And when you start losing that, then I think, we've seen in the past how bad things happen.
So this one is from Eric Johnson. And this is a great grassroots question. As a grassroots organization, what can citizens do to create ideas, drive solutions, help to convince our lawmakers that they need to be courageous, they need to take that stand? In your minds, working with your colleagues, how can the folks that are listening at home, the folks in the room, do something to put this issue at the forefront?
Well, this is controversial, but I believe it with all my heart because I've studied the history. The founders never, ever saw the rise of the career politician. They just didn't see it. It was a part-time gig for 130 years. I firmly believe in term limits. I put a bill in 2015 that'll never see the light of day up here because most people in this business who are elected don't believe in term limits. They say, well, you have term limits. They're called elections, and that's just not true. You have these committees that are set up here that are their in full intent and purpose is to get, on both sides, to get the incumbents reelected, not to put the best person in the seat. When I got elected, there were so few business people in the Senate, it was pitiful. There were a lot of lawyers, I get that, but there weren't a lot of business guys. Well, you have to have lawyers to write the laws and all that, and a lot of staff are, and thank God they are, but Nothing against lawyers, but I mean, we had over 60.
As a recovering lawyer, I agree with you.
So the number one thing I think you could do is to hold elected officials accountable. Somebody's got to be accountable for this. And yet, I hate Congress, but I love my congressman. You ever heard that? Okay. We're all guilty. That's you and me. We're all guilty. And at the grassroots level, who do we support? Look at who we get behind for president. We have people who this time and last time on our side and this time on their side who are raising their hand who have no executive experience. If you were a board looking at the resume, you'd say they've never done anything that would allow them to step that far to be the leader of the free world. And yet we all get behind our favorite horse without qualifying them. My view is this crisis wasn't created by elected officials. It was created by the people who elected the elected officials. That's you and me. For 40 years, I was in business, fat, dumb, and happy, just running, trying to make a living for my family, get my kids educated, save a little bit of money for retirement. And I woke up one day and I said, oh my goodness, I saw this coming. And now we got to do something about it. So I think the number one thing you can do is hold us accountable. Number two is send emails. Be practical. Educate your people about what you're hearing today at a grassroots level. And don't be bashful about it. I got over sounding conspiratorial a long time ago, Russ. I mean, seriously. When you know the facts will win the argument hands down. The third thing is communicate with your own elected officials. Tell them how serious you think this is and tell them you expect results. And the fourth is every election we have, make this the issue in the election. When I ran I pulled political advisors around me and they all said, oh, David, you can't get elected talking about the debt. You got to have an issue. I said, this is the issue. So we talked about it for 2 years. And guess what? I got elected. I think that can happen in a lot of places. This has got to be the issue of our generation. You started out the conversation saying that the next generation has lower economic prospects than the prior. That's the first time in U.S. history that that's ever happened. And most economists, most socioeconomic people who are looking at this believe that's the truth. I believe we can reverse that, but only if you start doing those four things I'm talking about.
So I think that's excellent advice for people to be passionate about this issue. It's interesting. I keep hearing people say, when I bring this up, I talk to folks, some colleagues, some people externally, and they say, well, the debt's a problem, but nobody really cares about it anymore. But the minute that you start to talk to just random people on the street, you find out that a lot of people still care about this issue. A lot of people are passionate. In 2 weeks, we put this together, and there are 100-plus people in a room tonight on a Tuesday night. I think people are desperate to see folks that have solutions,
right, that
are willing to drive and be courageous. And so I think that's great advice. This is going to go from grassroots to budget expert. So Mark Goldwyn is over here from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. And his question was, what should we do to prevent sequestration on October 1st?
Yeah.
Should we pay for increases in the caps or add to the debt?
So here's the question. I don't think it matters. At this point, the real problem is not in that bottom line. So whatever we do in discretionary domestic spending or whatever we do in domestic military spending to get past this sequestration, the blue line down there is a rounding error compared to the red line that I'm talking about, trying to get everybody to focus on. If we would have as much conversation about how to save Social Security and Medicare as we will over the incremental amount that we're going to spend there, we would not be having this meeting because we would have already solved the problem. Doesn't mean that we need to be irresponsible, because I think that and by the way, under President Trump, we have the first audit of the DOD in U.S. history. Now listen to this. In 91, Congress passed a law that required a president to get an audit done in the DOD. In a budget committee, I'm in there and one of the inspector generals, and I said, why don't we have a budget? This is in a hearing. He said, oh, sir, we can't have a budget. We're too large. We're too complex. I said, wait a minute. You're only a little bit bigger than Walmart. Can you imagine Walmart not doing an SEC filing or not doing their IRS paperwork? Can you imagine that? No. So guess what? I told President Trump when he gets elected, well, yeah, we're going to have an audit. 1 year to the day almost, we have the first audit. Then I asked the guy, I said, okay, that's an audit. When are we going to get a clean audit? He said, oh, sir, I knew you were going to ask that question. We've been working really hard. If we continue to get funding, we can give you a clean audit in 6 years. So, yeah, no, we're going to do better than that. I can trust you that we'll do better than that. But the point is, we have an audit on the third largest line item. We don't know, we don't have any oversight and control in the top two line items, and that's Social Security and Medicare trust fund deficits that we're trying to take care of.
So I know we're up against a hard stop. I'll finish with the hardest question of the night. You a bulldog or a yellow jacket?
I'm a yellow jacket, but I've learned how to say go dog. So, I mean, that tells you where I'm in this life. So, Russ, this is so good. I got to tell you this. I don't know any other organization other than AFP that is shining the light on the most critical priorities. And this is what this is about. One of the frustrations I have in Congress is that in the Senate, we don't always deal with the priority. And that's what this community does. And who is this community? It's America. I mean, the leaders get a lot of grief sometimes about stepping out. Well, thank God they are. But this group is made up of people just like you all over the country. I've been blessed in the last 4.5 years to travel all over the country and to talk to people just like you. They see these priorities. It's sometimes the elected officials up here trying to get reelected that don't sometimes get it. So thank you guys for shining a light on this critical issue tonight.
Would you all join me in thanking Senator David Perdue?